Sup guys, Bjorn here. So with the new patch, there's always a ton of rerolling going on, the flavor of the month guys, they want to know what's poppin'. Everyone wants to pump, obviously on the damage meters, but how close is the balance actually between the top end and the lower end, the single target pumpers and the trash tier specs, what is the actual difference there? And is it even worth swapping for you, even if you're maybe a hunter or something really horrible, Maybe you don't wanna be at the bottom of an entire patch. Well, we'll get the bottom of that. We will take a look at a very concrete example here as well. I will be doing it from Castle Nethra, obviously, because that's where we have the logs from. Before we get into that though, make sure you subscribe and like if you like the video, and leave a comment if you have any takes on the balance right now, or maybe on the community's perception of the balance. That would be very fun to have a discussion about, so make sure you comment. Okay, so let's say you're Fury Warrior. You're Fury Warrior on Hungering Destroyer here, and you're kind of pumping. You're pretty good at your spec, right? You're maybe doing an 80 log. Now I'm choosing Hungering because it's a single target fight. It doesn't have any weird damage shenanigans, any stupid stuff going on with it. It's also the only like pure single target damage in the raid, except Sludge Fist, which does have those damage amps, right? So that's why I'm looking at Hungering here. Obviously, fight time will still matter and stuff like that. So it's not the perfect boss by any means, and logs are never perfect by any means either. So keep that in mind, guys. But I'm still just here to prove an example. So you're pretty good at Warrior, right? You're maybe getting in our 80th percentile parse, and you're thinking, I'm parsing pretty well, but I'm kind of still at the bottom of the meters here. I'm not really doing too well. Maybe I'm looking at the Shadow Priest SS rogues. Wow, I really want to change. Maybe I should swap. Maybe I should look at what's good for 9.1, right? Well, is it actually worth it? Or are you gonna end up losing more DPS swapping than you would end up gaining from being a stronger class, right? Because Fury Warrior here at 5413 DPS, well, if you're swapping down to an alt, you're probably gonna lose some DPS by just being worse at the spec, right? Even if you're practicing it, even if you're doing your due diligence, you're actually going out there practicing, you have put the time and effort into to know the spec, you're probably always gonna be a little worse than on your main, obviously, and especially early on. And then you're probably also gonna have a little bit worse gear, right? So we can assume some DPS loss from that as well. It's not unreasonable to think that you would probably be a little bit behind on gear swapping. And those two combined are actually going to end up mattering quite a lot, we'll see here. So if we take all that into account, especially on like a mythic difficulty, and you might also have some problems with the utility of your class, right? Your new spec might not have the same mobility, maybe you have less survivability, and you struggle because of that. That's also going to end up be reflected in your DPS after all. So let's assume you drop from an 80th percentile log here to a 50th percentile log on your new spec, right? Remember, Fury Warrior at 80th was at 5413 DPS. We can see here, Shadow Priest at a 50th percentile is the top single target parser at 5576 DPS. So sure, you would end up gaining like 150 DPS here, but that's not too much, right? Then we go on to Assas Rogue, still a little bit above. Third is Aflok, sorry, and that's already behind the 80 parsing Fury Warrior, right? And 80th percentile parses are not that hard to get, right? They're pretty reasonable. So already we can see him outperforming someone maybe who are a little bit more unexperienced on the class here. And the further you go down, you see here that the Fury Warrior is actually pretty much shitting on every other single spec in the game at that point. And if you're any of these specs here above the Fury Warrior on the 80th percentile, maybe you're a sub rogue, you're an enhancement shaman, you're complaining, you're an outlaw rogue, you're like, fuck, I'm not that great right now, red paladins. Well, the same goes for you, right? You would end up doing more damage with this parse here than you would at the 50th percentile. So definitely something to keep in mind there. And another way of visualizing it would be to compare at the top end, right, the 99th percentile, for example, to where you actually start to get outperformed at the lower end. So Fury Warrior at the pretty much the maximum performance, right? 99th percentile is basically as high as you're gonna get almost. Well, at that point you're doing 6,232 DPS. We can go to the 50 logs here. You know, 6,200 are gonna be well above those guys we just talked about. At the 70 percentile, you know, you're still gonna outperform every single spec in the game here. You're gonna be above the Shadow Priest still, 50 DPS above the Shadow Priest. At the 80th percentile, there you start to get outperformed by the Shadow Priest, but still you're above the Assassination Rogue. I mean, so if you're an absolute beast on Fury Warrior, you're pumping, right? You're playing it to the spec to its maximum pretty much, then you can definitely outperform almost every single spec of the game if the player is better. So the balance is definitely very close. I'll just go back to this slide here for a while, let you take a look at those. Maybe the fire mages in the chat have something to say about this one, you know. So you remember Arcane and Frost Mage? Back at the 80 logs, you know, they were kind of chilling down in a dumpster. It gets even worse at the 50 logs, you know, god damn, like those Frost Mage parses, what is going on here, guys? Well, at the top end, Arcane actually performs better in fire, and so does Frost, by a very, very tiny margin that is still, but... And keep in mind, these things can always be like fight time and PI usage and stuff like that. It's not... You can't trust logs 100%, guys, remember that. Now, then what is the reason for fire being so much lower here, while even at the 80 logs, you know, it's not that much worse, right? They're still so much ahead. Why is that? Well, is it easier to play, maybe? The worst players are performing better on fire? No. It's just that the number of parses for fire is so much higher, right? Everyone is playing fire, and the community has latched on to the idea of fire being broken. Everyone's playing fire, and therefore it's gonna have a much wider range of damages, much more good players playing it, you know. Now, when fire isn't that great anymore, you can see at the top end that the good players are pushing Arcane and Frost to their limits and outperforming fire, while at the bottom end, well, or at the lower end, I mean, 80th percentile Mythic Hungry and Destroyer logs is by no means the lower end of the player base. I'm just saying, like, the lower end of Mythic, maybe, if that is anything. Well, obviously it is, but whatever. I'm going off on tangents here. My point is that here Frost Mage and Arcane Mage hasn't been recognized as strong, or it's simply the fact that Shadowlands has disincentivized swapping specs so much, right? For the mages, it's particularly awful, right? They have Night Fae for fire, they have Curian for Arcane, and their Venture for Frost, and most people obviously roll Night Fae fire at the start of the expansion for obvious reasons, right? It was really good in both Raid and Mythic Plus, so... And these logs are also from the last 2 weeks, so that might also explain why Arcane and Frost is a little bit higher here. A lot of the mages have probably also swapped off fire. But either way, no matter the Shadowlands Covenant situation, no matter the unwillingness to swap, you know, stuff like that, my point still stands that Blizzard's balance is really good, and it is possible, if you're good at a spec, to just outperform a lot of other people playing worse at better specs, right? And remember that these logs here are also like wildly exaggerated, right? Because as we already talked about, the number of parses is one thing, but also like a good class on any given fight, right? If the Shadow Priests and the Arcane Mages and the Demologs are pumping on Hungering, well, guess what? Then they're gonna get all the PIs, all the external buffs, you know, all the damage increases, and everyone is gonna play around them. And also, as I said before, a ton of good players are gonna play those specs and push them to their limits, while as the Survival Hunters, you know, there's no good players playing Survival Hunter because it's just the worst spec in the game. There's no denying that, right? But because no good players are playing Survival Hunter, while it could possibly be higher on the meters here, it just isn't because there's no one pushing it to its limits. And the same can be said for like every single other spec in that situation. For example, the sub rogues, the outlaw rogues, if Assas is the best rogue spec, well, then all of the good rogue players are going to play Assas. That's just how it goes, But that doesn't mean that all of the mediocre rogue players have to play Assas as well. Then you're going to be much better playing your favorite spec that you're really good at and just outperforming the other mediocre assassination rogues in your raid, right? You just have to be realistic about your situation, where you're at. If you're like raiding at a level that isn't the very top end, then you would just be better off playing something that you're very comfortable with. So for example, if a spec is 1% above something else, if one spec is 1% ahead on single target, well, then that's going to be a huge deal for the top end, because they need that percentage to kill the boss, right? That percentage for limit in the world first race means that they're going to win over Echo, right? While as for your normal average heroic curve raider, it doesn't mean shit, right? 1% is going to be wildly outperformed by that player's skill level, or the skill gap between two players on different classes, right? So it can't be compared to the lower end. It's still understandable that the lower end of the community, or I'm saying lower end. When I say lower end, I'm basically talking about everything that isn't like the very top end of mythic progression, right? I'm considering myself in the lower end as well. Everything that isn't like affected by these very small tuning changes, and basically everything that can be cleared with like any comp is a low end, honestly. Like, that's just how it is. You could definitely clear entire mythic Nathria with like pretty much any comp. Like, obviously you would still need the raid buffs and stuff, but that's not hard to get, right? That's just a thing about the game. You don't need like a ton of DPS pumpers, you don't need a ton of good single target specs, you don't really need anything specific other than like bring most classes and you're fine, right? That's just how it works at anything except the very top end. But I understand that the lower end of the community wants to emulate the top end, because they also want to have fun, they want to pump, they want to do the very best they can, and sometimes that just means that they're sacrificing more DPS than they're gaining, sadly. And I think that's true in a lot of cases, and it's not also like always about DPS. Sometimes it's just about not living up to your expectations, right? You swap to a spec to do a certain thing, and then you realize that the spec is not actually that good at doing that thing, except when you're in a very controlled environment or a very coordinated environment. So also something to keep in mind, everything you see on streams or in high keys or stuff like that is just not going to be completely replicable in your average gameplay. And when you see Limit bringing 4 Shadow Priests to every single raid boss, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need any Shadow Priests to finish the raid at all. You can run 0 Shadow Priests and you'll be completely fine. Yeah, I went on a real tangent here in the latter end of the video, but there's just one more thing I want to touch on. Let's fucking get through this number of parses here. Do you see what I'm saying here with the number of parses? You see how Unholy Death Knight, just the first example, Unholy Death Knight, 6,800 DPS. Then we have Frost down at 6,200 roughly. Well, Unholy Death Knight has 2,000 more parses, almost fucking how much, like, what is that, 6 times the number of parses, 7 times the number of parses? It's insane. No wonder they're like that far ahead. And this just means that the actual Blizzard number, the actual raw number, the balance number between these might be like half of this, or even a third, or I have no idea what fraction of this it is, but it's certainly not as big a difference as it seems here. And the same goes for like every other single spec in the game, right? You look at Druids, everyone is playing Balance, no one is playing Feral. You look at Hunters, like there's some split between Marksmanship and Beast Mastery, but then we have Survival now at 50 parses, How can you expect Survival to live up to its potential when it has 50 parses compared to the 3,600 of Balance Druid? It's just, frankly, like, laughable. It's so sad that the community thinks that Survival Hunter is this horrible. Right? It's not that horrible from a pure DPS perspective. It's just that the top very top end, the 1%, the 0.0.1% at the top end, they have literally no reason to bring a survival hunter, right? They have every single resource in the world. They can bring as many like class stacking as they want, as many warlocks as they want, as many busted shadow priests as they want. They have no reason to bring a survival hunter, so why would they, right? But for your average heroic raider survival player who just wants to play survival and have fun, he's not going to be this far behind on DPS. It's just something that has been extremely exaggerated by the logs and everyone just wanting to play the best thing, right? The same goes for mages here. We have the extraordinarily large amount of parses on fire. We can see that some mages have definitely swapped though. So that's, as I suspected, probably why Arcane and Frost is a bit higher here. But you can still see that the vast amount of those parses were on fire and it's still the last, so keep that in mind. And you know, the rogue, similar, 29 sub parses, by the way. Sad. And it still performed pretty well here, so sub on single target might not be completely dead, but then again, like, they have assets, why would you play sub, right? Comes down to the same problem again. 29 parses is pretty sad though. Maybe we need some more sub rogues in the chat actually. Same goes for shaman, kind of, you know, warrior as well. Every spec is going to be like this at some point. Actually, not a lot of players playing demo compared to the other two. That's a little weird. I would actually expect more people to play demo than Destro on this fight. That's weird. Whatever. Yeah, that's pretty much the video, guys. It did get a little rambly at the end here, but make sure to keep this in mind. Don't freak out about the balance. Blizzard balance is really tight. It's actually really good. It's just exaggerated by the community. It's exaggerated by logs. It's exaggerated by pretty much every single natural thing that's going to happen in the game. And it's just the way it is. The only thing we can do about it is just to keep it in mind. Like, know that behind the scenes, it's not this big of a difference. Know that behind the scenes, bringing the best player always matters over the class, right? Just keeping that in mind and knowing that is going to make such a huge difference compared to you just blindly going in, listening to every, like, this is going to be the best spec next tier reroll to it, you know. Those things are fun to do, and I love speculating about those things, but that doesn't mean that everyone should just blindly listen to that and just go reroll for no reason, right? What content creators talk about when they do these like tier lists and these rankings and stuff like that, they are talking about the literal top end, because that's the only way you can ever do such a ranking, right? If I would do a tier list and I would just say that, you know, every single spec is balanced very well and there's really no reason to bring anything over the other, well, then it would be a shit tier list. So obviously I'm gonna do one that actually highlights the small differences and exaggerates them, because that's the only way we can actually look at the differences between the specs, when in reality the differences aren't that great, especially not in the DPS point of view, right? From the utility point of view, there are some big disparities, but when it comes down to how much classes pump, it's usually very close. And sure, there are going to be some outliers, like some specs are obviously always going to be better on single target, some specs are going to be better on AoE. That's just the way it is, and Shadow Priest is surprisingly broken right now, sure, but overall the balance is very good, guys. Okay. That's gonna be fucking it. It's been on way too long now. See you boys in the next one.